Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Just so that everybody's aware, we are recording today's meeting and it will be available on forestrywebinars.net, just so that you're aware of that. To kick things off, let me remind everybody that the title of today's webinar is the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on forestry in the U.S. South. Just so that you're aware, the slides are available today on the portal where you joined. Towards the bottom of the page, you can download a PDF version of today's slides, as well as a journal article that was written related to today's topic. We will take questions throughout the webinar. If you enter those into the Q&A feature, all you got to do is click on the little icon that has Q&A, type in your questions, and we will moderate those at the end of today's session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rajan Perajuli here at North Carolina State University. Rajan?
Thank you, Bob. Let me share my screen. Hope it is visible. All right. Thank you, Bob. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to learn something on our ongoing works on evaluating the COVID-19 pandemic on various sectors of forestry supply chain in the U.S. South. So the title of the talk today, like Bob already mentioned, is impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on forestry in the U.S. South. So before we jumped into today's topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about the broader project, which is multi-institution, multi-year, funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture in partnership with the University of Georgia, Auburn University, and the USDA Forest Service. This project aims to evaluate the impacts of pandemic on forestry and the forest product industry throughout the supply chain, and identify, develop, and disseminate the strategies to revitalize the southern forest-based rural economy in the post-pandemic era. So the broader project covers the pandemic impact evaluation on timber markets, forest-based employment, including the seasonal migrant S2B workers, forest landowners, and the forest product industry as well. But today's talk includes only the timber markets, specifically timber stump-based price impacts and forest-based employments. So before we jump into today's talk, I would like to briefly mention about our ongoing forest landowner survey, which also aims to examine the pandemic impacts on forest landowner revenues, networks, land management, stewardship practices, and future plans all across the South. It is currently online via only Qualtrics, but we are currently working on expanding it through other survey modes, including mail survey with research incentives. We'd like to sincerely request you as a landowner to participate in the survey if you own at least 20 acres of land in the southern states, and or share it through your network so that we can capture the representative landowner voice. Thank you. All right, so let's move to today's objectives. We plan to cover 4 different studies, primarily looked into the pandemic impact evaluation on employment, prices, and supply chain. So let me introduce our main presenters today, Dr. Stephanie Chizmar and Dr. Sonia Brock, both research economists with the USDA Forest Service. Brief bio. First, Dr. Chizmar obtained an MS in natural resources and PhD in forestry and environmental resources with minor in economics from NC State University. So as a graduate student, research associate, and postdoctoral scholar at NCSU, she completed research related to agroforestry policies and forest landowner programs. And she started her career with the U.S. Forest Service in September 2022 with Southern Research Station in Research Triangle Park. So her research areas primarily include the economics of natural and human-related forest disturbance and forest product markets and trade. And similarly, Dr. Brock is also a research economist, and she received her master's and PhD from Oregon State University from the Department of Forest Ecosystem and Society, and held a postdoctoral position here at North Carolina State University with us before joining to the USDA Forest Service last year. So her research also explores timber markets, forest products trade, and forest disturbances using the combination of econometrics and qualitative methods. Dr. Brock's work has examined agroforestry adoption and profitability and timber utilization across national forest as well. With this, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Chismar first, and then I think Dr. Brock will follow. Let me stop sharing my screen, and Steph, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for the invitation to speak today and for the introduction. So for you, those of maybe not aware, there was a lot of information that was collected during the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of data is available or was available during this time, and that includes data on infections, movement, so map requests from phones, prices of goods and services, as well as policies, which are depicted in this slide. So specifically looking at policies that the CDC kept logs of. So on the left here, we see no policy is in policy 0, and then other policies that were present in the United States. Policy 4 is crossed out just because it was not found in our study area. And these policies varied by enactment date, duration, so for how long they lasted, the target population, as can be seen through the descriptions, as well as the locations that they pertain to. And I know on the right there's a lot going on, but we'll focus one line at a time and just go an example to show you basically that these policies were enacted sequentially. They were passed within days. And so this is largely from the county level or the state level. We look at this brown line here, which represents policy 5, the recommendation. Several counties enacted the policy as early as March and April of 2020. Even so more passed the policy, and it looks like it peaked right around July and August. So they passed it in May and June, and then it started to taper off. What's important to note, since we are looking here either at the bi-monthly or monthly period, we could see that in some cases, as in this yellow line, where county or state enacted the mandatory lockdown policy, so policy 1, it expired, and then they passed the policy 5 recommendation. And so I'm going to specifically focus on policy 1, but so Dr. Brook will focus on policy 1, as well as some of these combinations of various policies. And I do want to note, in addition to these state and county level responses, we actually have the federal government respond fairly quickly to the World Health Organization's designation of the COVID-19 pandemic as a global pandemic. And that was through the creation or through the declaration of essential industries. And so the forest products and forestry and forest products industry was declared essential about 1 week after that World Health Declaration. However, not all of the furniture manufacturing industry was included in that. And so I'll mention that a little bit more in my analysis. But again, I'm looking specifically at that mandatory lockdown policy. This is just another depiction of that policy alone and when it was enacted by counties over time. And so we can see from the bottom here by states that we have a few states that enacted it as early as March. It's like most maybe in the April area, and then a few also still had the policy in May of 2020, but we do not see the policy outside of that time period. And my objective specifically looking at the impact of that policy on forest-based employment. And we defined the forest sector to include 4 industries: forestry and logging, wood product manufacturing, pulp and paper manufacturing, and furniture manufacturing. And I had mentioned in the previous, or one of the previous slides, that furniture manufacturing was largely declared non-essential. I think only one sub-industry was declared essential, whereas all the rest of these industries were all declared essential by the federal government very quickly, about 1 week again after that declaration. I also aggregated employment or jobs in these sectors or in these industries to create one aggregate for a sector to see how it fared against the impacts of this policy. And we specifically focused on what were called forest dependent counties, using the definition utilized by Fry et al. In 2022. They characterize forest dependence based on 3 criteria. And so a community or county only needs to meet one of these criteria in order to qualify. So they can qualify environmentally if they have at least 75% of their land in forest land. Economically, if they employ 10% of their workforce in the forest sector, or 15% of the earnings in that county come from the forest sector. And then lastly, they could qualify as social. So that's using the indigenous population as a threshold, as well as a forest land use minimum. And I just wanted to note that their definition of the forest sector is slightly different than ours. There was some overlap with forestry and logging, wood product manufacturing, as well as paper manufacturing. However, they also included hunting and trapping, support activities for forestry, and did not include the furniture manufacturing industry. And so I utilized a type of what's called causal inference analysis, which Dr. Brooke will speak on other methodologies or another methodology within that framework. So that allows us to use what's called a quasi-experimental design. So it's not a completely controlled experiment like we learn in science class, where we're able to manipulate everything as it goes through. This is something that we have data from that's already happened, but we have these different characteristics that allow us to use this methodology. And I specifically use the two-way fixed effect, or what's called difference in difference. And so this methodology allows me to estimate an average effect on the treated group. And so it requires that we have 2 groups, so treatment, that's going to be exposed to the policy in this case, or the control group, those units that are never going to experience the policy. And I have to have data before the policy is enacted as well as after it's enacted. And as we can see in the table below, this allows us to have one group of units that are going to be treated. And so we assume, based on assumption I'll mention in the next or upcoming slide, the specific conditions that would allow us to estimate, okay, what is that average impact of a county that's under a lockdown policy? So how is employment impacted while they're under that policy compared to a county that's not under that policy? So I'm not sure if you obviously picked up on this when I presented this graph without the numbers underneath in one of the previous slides, but certain states enacted this policy 1 as early as March, including Louisiana, North Carolina, and Virginia. Some didn't pass it until April, where it lasted 1 month. Some cases it lasted 2 months, which is the difference between Alabama and Florida. And what you're seeing these numbers, it's just counts of counties with that policy. And then we have 2 states that never enact the specific policy. So these act as our pure control units that we compare our treatment effect against. We also, because of the complications of this design, of the fact that it gets murky and how some units are treated for 1 month, some are 3 months, how do you compare these apples to apples? That can get a little convoluted in this methodology. So because of these characteristics, we also estimated what's called a panel event study. And so the easiest way to explain this is with a results table or a graph. So spoiler alert, this includes some of our results here, but it allows us to estimate individual treatment effects at each month. So this line here is 0. So if these bars include this red line in their estimate, then that means there's no impact. And so we're looking specifically after this dark line, which is 1 month after or prior to treatment, and treatment's at 0. And so anytime these lines are either always above or always below, such as these 3 cases here, that means there's a significant difference between our treated and control group. And so again, this just allows us to measure these effects at individual months instead of being averaged over multiple periods. And again, we focus specifically in forest-dependent counties in the US South. So those are depicted in green here. You'll notice that we did not include data for Oklahoma and Kentucky, and that's just because one of our data sets that Dr. Perk will mention later doesn't include that area. So we're specifically looking at these green counties in the US South. And we're assessing that policies one impact on employment. And so we utilized the US Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census of employment from data set from January 2017 to December 2020. And I had mentioned earlier that there's an assumption, or there's actually 2, but one of the assumptions behind these types of methodologies is the idea that what's happening in the control units is the same thing that's happening in the treated units prior to treatment. And that's needed to say, okay, this treatment is what's causing a difference if there is one we observe. So one way I assess this is by mapping basically average employment by county and by group. So these are the control units, or those pure controls, those counties in Arkansas and Texas, and the treated is everything else in our data set. And we can see they somewhat follow similar patterns. In some of the cases, one may be more pronounced, and that could be just because of our the sample size, the mathematics getting in there and making kind of one more smooth line that's smoother than the other. However, if you look at the bottom here, we do not see a similar trend prior to treatment in the control versus treated. That's likely due to a mill in Arkansas that transitioned into a new product. And so I can't tell if it just transitioned completely into a new industry, and so you see this surge in employment, or if when they transition to this new product, they're actually able to increase their employment, or a combination of those. All I can see is that they went from one month to another, drastically increasing their employment, which was not observed in our treated. So that adds in some complications for how we interpret our results. I also use these graphs to visually see if there's any impacts on average after COVID. So that's what's depicted in this blue line. And we can see in some cases a pronounced drop, in other cases, not so much. And so getting to the results, I found that in most cases, the specific policy did not significantly impact employment in the forest sector, except for one industry, and that's the wood product manufacturing industry, so sawmills, which on average had experienced 19% lower employment in those counties that had an active policy compared to those that didn't, while they were under that policy. And I have one expectation of why we only saw these results, and that could be because sawmills were pretty quick early in the pandemic to respond by reducing their productivity in anticipation of uncertain markets and conditions due to the pandemic. And so they actually reduced a lot of their employment as well as productivity in their manufacturing facilities. We also, again, estimated these panel event studies, and I know this is a lot, so I'll just try to go over this one by one. We did see significant impacts in the aggregate forest sector, that variable that I created based on employment in all of those industries, up to 9 months. And it's hard to tell because of the scale here that technically doesn't include 0 after the policy had been in place. So we see, again, this is by determining if these bars include this red line or not. And it, again, is during this time when it is significant, employment was about 4 to 11% lower in those counties that had a policy. And then the wood product manufacturing, we saw similar results. So about 19 to 27% less employment in treated counties compared to those in the control counties up to about 8 months after those policies were enacted. So after March or April, depending when they were first passed by the state. And this again is in comparison to what's happening 1 month prior to treatment. So that's our base of where we're comparison. So kind of to put a bow on that, if you remember, all these policies were largely only active for 1 to 3 months. So we are wondering why we're seeing significant impacts several months after they've been lifted, and whether there's other things going on, such as other policies, or there's these delay or impacts we're seeing are actually delayed. Not necessarily sure. And just to conclude on this objective before moving on to Dr. Brooks' material, policies for this specific type of policy, the lockdown policy for all individuals, had relatively limited average impacts. We did not see significant impacts to the aggregate forest sector, nor 3 of the industries of interest. We did see a significant decrease in wood product manufacturing. And also that we saw some of these significant differences up to 8 to 9 months after these policies were enacted in March or April. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn the floor over to Dr. Brooke. You're still muted, Sonia.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, Dr. Chismar, for that was really a great start to all of these COVID-19 studies that we're doing. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, and we'll pick up with objective 2. Okay, so Dr. Chismar just presented on the employment impacts, and we're going to move to the price impacts. So objective 2, we're quantifying the causal effects of the COVID-19 lockdown. Remember that policy 1 on roundwood prices in the US South. So as Dr. Chismar mentioned, we're using causal inference estimators. So for this study, we use the time regression discontinuity estimator. And just for an example to understand how this estimator works, let's say, for example, you're on a road trip and you're starting near Tijuana, Mexico. And let's just say that the gas is around 75 cents a gallon. So you see here, you're in mile 0 and it's about 75 cents. And as you start driving towards California, the gas is linearly increasing in price. And as you reach mile 60, 65, all of a sudden the gas jumps from about $1.50 a gallon to about $3.25 a gallon. Why? Well, as soon as you cross that US-Mexico border, that gas price increased because of the policies that are different between the US and Mexico, right? There's a border there, a geographical border that we could assume that there's different impacts on both sides of that border. So that's what we call a running variable. That running variable in this case is miles. However, when we're looking at COVID-19, our running variable is time. So before March 2020, we didn't have COVID-19 that was widely spreading in the United States. And then after March 2020, we did. So that provides us a very clear discontinuity in especially policies, like those COVID-19 policies that were incurred at that time. So what we would expect to see, this data set here on the screen is fictional, but what we would expect to see in our price data for exploring this COVID-19 topic is to see a similar discontinuity in price. And that way we could maybe assume that this estimator is the best one to use. So the data, again, is the same data that Dr. Chismar used for prices. So we use the forest to market data. It covers 11 southeastern states from Virginia to eastern Texas. It covers 11,004 counties, and it's broken into 39 micro markets. And again, as Dr. Chismar mentioned, there was never any lockdown policy that occurred in Texas or Arkansas over the entire policy period. So we know that all policies, even federal policies, recently ended in May of 2023. Okay, so let's visually inspect this discontinuity, right? Like, let's graph out the prices and see if we can see a discontinuity similar to the discontinuity in the fictional data. So very clearly, we can see that pine pulpwood price was about $8.30 per ton. And then after period 9, the price decreased to about $7.40 per ton. Again, for pine sawtimber, prices were around $23.20 per ton. And then in period 9, they dropped to about $22.65. So we can see clearly that the price was, for example, increasing, and then there's a stark decrease. So we could say, okay, maybe this is a good estimator to use to look at this price decrease. According to some of the literature, we can assume that there's a time lag between the behavioral changes that we would see and the price changes. So this Liu et al. 2021 study used a time lag. So we chose to conduct the analysis in this, what I'm calling period 9. So in January to February 2019, that was period 1. March to April 2019 is period 2. All the way through period 9, which is May, June 2020. So we would assume that we're not going to see any big price changes or behavioral changes showing up in the data right when the policy is enacted. We conducted some sensitivity analyses in the manuscript, looking at both periods 7 and 8 to assess the price changes as well. So there's a lot more work that you can read about. I believe that article was shared with everyone. Okay, so what did we find? We found that this table presents the TRD estimates for each roundwood product, and we find the estimates to be statistically significant at the 1% level. Pine chip and saw price dropped by about 6.8% after lockdown, and pine sawtimber price dropped by about 12% after lockdown. Additionally, pine pulpwood price dropped by approximately 26% after lockdown, and hardwood sawtimber dropped by around 14% after lockdown. And then finally, hardwood pulpwood dropped by approximately 30% after lockdown. Okay, so some quick objective to conclusions. Overall, the lockdown policies had a decreasing price effect on roundwood in the US South, ranging from about 7% for pine chip and saw to a 30% decrease for pine pulpwood. And maybe this seems a little counterintuitive, right? We all know that the story of demand really increased in the pandemic for wood products, including demand for PPE, that personal protective equipment, masks and gowns. Do-it-yourself home projects increased. People were doing home additions and putting decks on their home, and people were there's a mass movement to work from home, so people were getting office furniture and the like. So why did we observe that price decrease soon after the lockdown policy was put in place? So in the literature, we found that there was a reduction in capacity of sawmills during that early lockdown period. Thus, there was a reduced demand for roundwood by sawmills, and also worker illnesses increased. That resulted in a shrinkage of the workforce by 3% from April to March during the same period. That information was from Presteman and Guo 2020. Thus, sawmills were unable to return to a higher level of production, even with that stronger consumer demand. Furthermore, there was an initial demand decrease early in the pandemic from consumer uncertainty. So people were concerned about job losses, about different economic conditions, and that information it can be read in this Del Rio Tronona et al. 2020 article. Okay, so objective 3 we wanted to assess the price effects of the varying COVID-19 policies across the South. So up until now, we've just looked at the lockdown policy, policy 1. And of course, we know that there are many other policies. So what was the effect, and how can we compare that effect to what we found with the first 2 studies? Okay, so as a reminder, the CDC recorded policies by day, by county. Oftentimes those policies came from a state order. Policy 4, this mandatory only for at-risk individuals in certain areas of the jurisdiction, was crossed out to show that this policy was never found in the US South. So policy 1, again, is that lockdown. Policy 0 is what we're calling no policy or order. So there was no COVID-19 policy in place if it received a 0. Policy 2 is mandatory only for all individuals in certain areas of the jurisdiction. Policy 3 is mandatory only for at-risk individuals in the jurisdiction. And policy 5 is that advisory or recommendation to stay home, which we know was in place for the longest time through the pandemic period. So for this study, we used what's called the fixed effects estimator. We use this to quantify the impacts of varying policies on roundwood prices. Again, not just that lockdown policy. The fixed effects estimator is used for time series data primarily, meaning effects through time. And we have this bi-monthly data set of 6 periods from 2019 to 2020. So the key is that we only estimate the effect for those variables that change across observations and through time. So characteristics such as elevation of the county are not included because elevation isn't changing significantly in a 2-year period. So the data that we included in these models includes what's called the Apple mobility data. So Apple, your phone that a lot of people have collected data on map requests. So when you type into your phone, I'd like to travel to Wilmington, North Carolina, it's going to record that as a map request. And so what Apple had is they actually took it down, but they had open access data on the number of requests above and below an estimated baseline. And so Apple estimated that baseline and made that information public. So anything above 100 baseline was more requests, and anything below the baseline of 100 was less requests. There was also product substitution that was added to the model. So in the independent variable side, we added all of the other products prices that we weren't estimating. So for example, if we were estimating a model for hardwood pulpwood, then on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, we would have hardwood saw timber, pine saw timber, et cetera, estimated as independent variables. We also had the CDC information, a bunch of information from the CDC, including COVID-19 case counts by county, policy days, so meaning the number of days that the policy was in place in the bi-monthly time period, and the percent of the population with COVID-19. So that percent of population was estimated by taking the number of people in the county and using the COVID-19 data to estimate a rough percentage of people that were infected with COVID-19. Okay, so what did we find? We found that policy 3 and 5 did not have a statistically significant effect. We did, however, find that the mandatory policy, the policy 1, that lockdown policy, decreased price by about 0.7% per day that it was in place. The mandatory only for all individuals in certain areas of the jurisdiction, it's a mouthful, that policy 2, decreased price of pine pulpwood by 5.6% per day that the policy was in place, and increased price of hardwood saw timber by 4% per day. So again, you can read this manuscript where we go over many of the assumptions and robustness checks of these models published in the Journal of Forest Business Research. And I hope that you take a look if you're interested. So some objectives, objective 3 conclusions, I should say. We continued to find a decrease in price for the lockdown policy. We found a decrease in price for pine pulpwood subject to policy 2, yet an increase in price for hardwood saw timber. So we've hypothesized that it may be possible that when harvest locations are uncertain, there may be a slight decline in supply, thus driving up prices for hardwood sawn timber. But really, I would caution against that hypothesis. We really need to do more research to better understand why there was that maybe perhaps counterintuitive price increase when we did see significant price decreases for all of the other estimations. All right, there were many limitations for these analyses. Primarily, other factors may impact roundwood prices as we move further away from the point in which policies were put in place. So that point in which the discontinuity we would expect to see is put in place. So there's things like the inflation impacts and increased fuel costs, the Ukraine war, which we know had an impact on fertilizer availability, that oligopsony power of roundwood purchasers or wood mills, meaning that there's few buyers, and the urban to rural housing demand increase that we saw during the pandemic. Okay, so objective 4. To explore the impacts of COVID-19 at various levels of the timber supply chain. So a lot of these limitations that I listed in the previous slide were why we decided to actually conduct this exploratory study to quantify those impacts of COVID-19 at various levels of the timber supply chain. So we tried to quantify challenges and opportunities through time during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Typically, when we're conducting or when a scientist conducts a qualitative study, they use fewer data points to explore understudied phenomenon. So we see here that we held four focus groups to better understand the impact of COVID-19 on the timber supply chain. We also aim to fill knowledge gaps that our previous quantitative studies were unable to answer, as I mentioned. So we had key informants from North Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. We had 15 total participants from contractors and consultants, landowners, and agency and association employees. So most of the people who participated in this study were agency and association employees. So we transcribed the focus groups verbatim and improved the reliability and validity of the transcripts by allowing members to go back and check their words. This is called member checks, which improves the reliability and validity of what individuals were saying in case they didn't get their point across clearly or wanted to adapt what they said a little bit to get their point across in a more clear manner. So we qualitatively coded these focus groups. The framework that we started with was originally put together by this person, Magabla, 2021, who wrote Supply Chains and the COVID-19 Pandemic, a comprehensive framework. So we adapted this framework to be relevant specifically to the timber supply chain effects in the US South. We also checked the reliability of our coding among multiple raters. So these are the people who are reading the transcripts and deciding what the framework should look like according to what individuals said in these focus groups. And to make sure that those raters aren't just randomly coding things willy-nilly, you conduct these what's called Krippendorf's alpha and pairwise agreement to make sure that people are coding those focus groups in a similar way. So good reliability is about 0.8, and the lower bound of reliability is about 0.6. for Krippendorf's alpha. So you can see that the lowest Krippendorf's alpha is 0.85, which is still good reliability. And the highest is 0.95 for the association and agency employees group. Again, so very good reliability among coders and raters. Okay, so here's the framework. Again, it's adapted from Magabla 2021. We kept the center ring the same as the Magabla framework. So it starts as supply disruptions, demand volatility, and government response. And we know that in economics, everything is the supply or demand, and then prices are also influenced by that government response. So the step 2, or the green ring, and the blue ring are the rings that we adapted to suit the US South timber supply chain. So let's zoom in on each of these pieces. Okay, so this is supply disruptions. And you can see that this green ring includes delivery changes, wood mill changes, logging changes, and on-hold production. And typically when participants were discussing delivery changes, they discussed input access was limited, delay in shipments. Remember, there was a really huge problem with those cargo shipping across on boats. There was a limited workforce, that worker illness, and fear of catching the disease. So a lot of people were afraid to go back to work. And high prices for inputs. Under wood mill changes, they often discussed worker health and so things such as being protective over worker health and encouraging masking and getting vaccinations. There was also a reduction in production capacity, adaptation challenges, so getting people to change to these new policies that were occurring, not just federal policies or state policies, but just policies within each institution itself. And then increased capital investment. A lot of participants discussed how the wood mills were actually making a lot of money during this time, and were reinvesting back in that wood mill to improve that wood mill. There was logging changes. Participants often discussed the aging population of loggers, that they were experiencing low incomes or lower incomes than they would expect. There was other attrition, as well as the worker health of specifically loggers. And then on-hold production includes that mill oligopsony, on-hold management, and H-2B and H-2A visas. So those H-2B and H-2A visas, if you're not familiar, is the H-2B is for forestry specifically, H-2A is ag, but includes Christmas tree workers. So that's visas for foreigners to come and work in these sectors. And there was oftentimes worry that those visas would stop or be reduced, and that would also reduce the amount of workers that people were able to hire. So let's look and see, this is a quote by an individual who said that the loggers and everyone else through the supply chain were forced to operate short-staffed, and that resulted in more serious and drastic increase in logging fatalities during that period, unfortunately. So this was coded as supply disruptions, logging changes, and worker health. And we do know from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics that there was a 33% increase in logging fatalities from 2019 to 2020. Okay, so let's look at demand volatility. There was landownership values, so that urban to rural movement, appreciation of land, perhaps an increase in financial planning during that time, since people had a little bit more time on their hands and were able to think about things that they maybe hadn't stopped to think about before the pandemic. Lack of benefits from higher demand, right? So we know that the wood mills were making a lot of money during that time, but perhaps the landowners weren't experiencing such great prices, right? So from our previous study, we saw that occur in the data. So there's forest products demand changes. So participants discussed how landowners were looking at alternative ways to make income during that time, including pine straw, agriculture, or perhaps agroforestry. There was an increased interest in carbon markets. There was a really high demand for Christmas trees during this time. There was an increase in outdoor recreation, especially on public lands, and perhaps an increase in interest in outdoor recreation on private lands, but mostly that consisted of hunting licenses. We saw some people that were more interested in planting longleaf pine as opposed to other southern yellow pine or loblolly pine. And an increase in people thinking about putting venues like VRBO or Airbnb on their land for these agro-tourism or trips where people were trying to get away from crowded spaces. And so this was a really good opportunity for landowners to capitalize on people still wanting to go on vacation, but maybe get away from a lot of people. And then finally, we had these shopping preference changes. As was discussed, people were increasing their demand for PPE. There was an increase in housing starts and also those do-it-yourself improvements. So this participant said, the wonders of the world and just taking a walk and on a sunny day in your flip-flops and looking at the longleaf pine and smelling it and just appreciating the outdoors. This increased for this individual during COVID-19. So this was coded as demand, land ownership values, and appreciation of land ownership. So we saw in the literature that there was a lot of discussion and research about shopping preference changes and recreation demand changes, again, as I mentioned, especially on public lands. So that's been very well documented in the literature, but what has not been so widely identified that we did identify through these focus group discussions was perhaps recreation demand changes on private lands, as I mentioned before, hunting and those venue spaces, and renewed appreciation of land ownership or land management planning that will also increase during this time. Okay, so finally, the government response, right? So we had the policy changes and the education and outreach. So policy changes including social distancing, or those stay-at-home policies, vaccinations. There was also government assistance programs to primarily businesses, inflation pressures, the stimulus checks went out to private individuals, and there was also the fear of the unknown. So some participants discussed how people were very afraid to even meet others outside because they didn't know how virulent the virus was, and there was a great fear of the unknown, especially early on in the pandemic. And then, of course, there's education and outreach, which increased during the pandemic, including Zoom and online access, lack of in-person events, and an increase in activities outside. So this individual says that they and some others thought naively that the lockdown would be 2 or 3 weeks and they could get back to doing their meeting. However, they soon realized that it wasn't going to go back to normal so quickly, and they had to accept that. And then they put a new plan in place and moved their meeting virtually. So this was coded as government response, education and outreach, and Zoom or online. So this Pratama et al. Article found that the change to online forums may have actually allowed for a greater diversity of participants and an increased access to education, which is kind of timely since we're doing this presentation online today, right? So this Zoom and online access, I think, is going to continue in the future and hopefully is able to bring in a lot of different people. You didn't have to come to North Carolina to hear this seminar today. Of course, there's some technical obstacles. You have to have a quality internet, which perhaps people in rural areas do not have access to, and maybe a barrier for older landowners. Okay, so some overall conclusions from all of these studies. So during COVID, The lockdown policies and partial lockdown policies had a decreasing price effect for most roundwood products in 2020 and a negative effect on employment in the wood products and manufacturing industry. Future analyses could look at the recovery or the periods just prior to the pandemic policies. So Dr. Chismar and myself looked at right when those policies were put in place, the effect, but there's other effects, as we know, once you move away from that point. In terms of future expectations, if something like a policy or a new policy was to be put in place again, could we expect a similar effect? Well, as Dr. Chismar had mentioned, the wood products industry, or at least most of it, was deemed essential after about a week after the mandatory lockdowns. So perhaps the effect in the future would be different, where perhaps the wood products and industry would already be deemed essential from the beginning. There wouldn't be that complete shutdown. After COVID, we found that landowners may benefit in the future from a renewed appreciation of land ownership, those potential new income opportunities, and the ability to gain new information via online and educational tools. And these new opportunities after the pandemic is something that we're very interested in learning about. I hope that if there's landowners on the call or listening later, that they'll please consider taking that landowner survey that Dr. Parajuli mentioned in the beginning. So thanks so much. I think we're open for questions now, or you can email us at a later time.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Stephanie, also, and Rajan. Great presentation, very interesting. And we do have a question that has come in. Folks, if you have questions, I ask that you use the Q&A feature of Zoom. Go ahead and click on that icon and enter them now. We have one that did pop up in the chat, so let me ask that of you. It's from Clay Thompson, and it said, did you look at change in demand for conservation easements during this time as part of the appreciation of the land?
Who wants to, you want me to take that one?
Sure.
We didn't, but that's a really great idea. I think that we did this exploratory analysis to kind of get our feet wet and see what we were missing and see where we could improve on data. But thanks for the suggestion. I think we'll take it.
Yeah, and just to add on that, I think our regional landowner surveys, I don't think on top of my head, I don't remember that we have exactly same questions asking about the conservation easements, but we have some approach, new initiatives like recreational stuff, like Sonia already mentioned. I hope our survey will answer some of that later. Thank you.
All right, does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to enter them in. All right, well, I thank everybody for their time today. Do appreciate it. Remember, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on forestrywebinars.net. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.